Welcome to Sharp Insights, Conversations with Your Plan Giving Experts, a podcast for development professionals. Whether you're new to the field or looking to enhance your existing program, we will provide practical tips, expert advice, and real-world stories to deepen your understanding of plan giving. If you're committed to securing long-term support for your nonprofit, you've come to the right place.
Welcome to Sharp Insights, Conversations with Your Plan Giving Experts. I'm your host, Grant Miller. For many gift planners, few conversations feel more intimidating than asking a donor to consider a gift in their will. We worry about saying the wrong thing, making the conversation awkward, or dwelling on the one topic that can be really hard to talk about, a person's mortality. But what if the science tells us we've been thinking about these conversations all wrong? Today's guest has spent years studying exactly that question. We're so excited to welcome back Dr. Russell James, professor of personal financial planning at Texas Tech University and one of the nation's leading experts in charitable giving. A former college president and plan giving director, Dr. James has published more than 150 works, and I'm sure that's steadily growing, on philanthropy and behavioral economics, and is frequently cited by outlets such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Chronicle of Philanthropy. Today we're going to explore why these conversations feel so difficult, what the research shows donors are really thinking, and the simple language that can help fundraisers approach legacy giving with greater confidence. Dr. James, welcome back to Sharp Insights. We're so glad to have you here.
Oh, thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Well, let's start with the basics. I think a lot of organizations, especially those who are starting out new plan giving programs, really struggle with asking a donor about their estate plans because it can feel uncomfortable, because it definitely does circle death. Mm. And I think a lot of people have a lot of anxiety about talking around that. And even those of us who are experienced professionals have issues with it. Why do you think that conversation creates so much anxiety?
Yeah, it's something that we see in research, that when people are reminded of their own mortality, they will tend to respond in one of two ways. Most people, most of the time, respond with avoidance. That is, I'm going to stay away from that reminder, or that doesn't really apply to me, or I'll get to it, but later. The other response after they've moved past that stage is the pursuit of symbolic immortality. This is the notion that my identity in some way lives on after death. It's kind of a hunger for permanence. Now, the reason that I bring that up is that if we lead with death, then for most people, most of the time, we're going to get a response that is an avoidance response. And that's kind of what feels uncomfortable when we are trying to bring this topic up. We're having that avoidance response ourselves. We might be creating the avoidance response in the other person. And so it actually can change the words and phrases that we use to try to not be very focused on using death words or using death language, because people will respond with avoidance. So Grant, let me give you a really quick research result. We ran an experiment trying to see what description for a gift in a will people were more interested in agreeing to. And it turned out people were dramatically more interested in make a gift to charity in my last will and testament. And they were dramatically less interested in make a gift to charity in my last will and testament. That will take effect at my death. It absolutely crushed the interest in the gift. Now, of course, we know that's the same thing, but just using those death words and that death language to introduce the idea triggered that avoidance response from people.
That makes sense to me. How do we open up this conversation? The last time you were on, we talked about Socratic dialogue. Is that something that we would use here to frame the conversation and try to get to that symbolic immortality response?
Yeah. So one of the things that we want to do is to communicate to the donor that people like them make gifts like this. So what do I mean by that? We might say something like, many donors who give as regularly as you have put our organization in their will. What are your thoughts about doing that? So notice we're beginning with their identity. that this is the kind of person they are. Here's another example. This comes from Mindy Alleman at Kent State. She said, she uses this phrase, "Mrs. Jones, you are such a wonderful and loyal donor. Many of our most loyal donors are including Kent State in their estate plans in order to make an impact beyond their lifetime. Have you ever considered remembering Kent State in your will?" Others will just say, "Hey, I can't say thank you enough for all of your support for so many years. Would you consider extending your amazing legacy by including us in your estate plans?" So there's a lot of different ways that we can bring the topic up. We can point out, for example, maybe we're having a campaign to reach 100 new Legacy Society members and give an update on the progress of that campaign. Maybe we've got a matching gift for people that will join the Legacy Society. There's a variety of ways where we can open up the topic. Sometimes we can just open it up by saying, well, part of my job is to show donors how to give smarter. For example, any IRA money inherited by family members triggers income taxes, but naming our organization as a beneficiary avoids those taxes. Notice what I've done there, Grant. I am talking about estate planning, but actually just introducing it as here's a tax smart way to give. So it is a way that we're introducing the topic, but not introducing it in the way of, you're going to die. Let's talk about that now.
Right, which is, that's definitely a thin line to walk there. So I guess two things. One, well, you mentioned tax incentives and savings and other, I guess, practical reasons why one might want to, say, leave an organization in their IRA. Where does the technical language fit into this? And do you want to lead with those sort of tax advantages? I know we want to avoid lots of technical languages, like don't want to say bequest over and over again and those sorts of things. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how to either soften that language or lead up to it?
Yeah, so here's some things to keep in mind. When it comes to the tax benefits, should we mention tax benefits? The answer is definitely yes. We know that people are much more interested in reading about material or even interested in making the gift when there are tax benefits. There is, however, a little bit of caution with that. And that caution is when we introduce that technical concept, whatever it might be, we want to, as much as possible, use simple language. Simple language and stories. That's what works. So we can talk about, you remind me of another donor. He was in a similar situation, and this is what he did. For a simple language, that means we don't use our technical insider terms, our financy terms, our legal terms to introduce the idea. And we've run a number of tests on this to show that every time we introduce the idea by using technical terms, it dramatically reduces interest. So for example, if we just describe what a charitable gift annuity does, it's a gift that pays you income for life, people are very interested in that. But if we say it's a gift that pays you income for life called a charitable gift annuity, well, now we're using financy terms, annuity, and the interest goes down in that. If we describe what a charitable remainder trust does, people are interested in it. But if we call it a charitable remainder trust, people are less interested in it. Now, one of the reasons that we don't want to lead with those technical terms is that that's the wrong frame of mind for sharing. That's going to trigger a market contract frame of mind where we're trying to get advantage, not a social family frame of mind where we're trying to share and make a meaningful impact. So we lead with simple words and stories, and that's going to be more powerful. Here's something else that's interesting. People are much more interested in reading about things like gifts in wills rather than estate giving, legacy giving, or bequest gifts. We ran one study where people were 2 times as likely to want to read about will planning than they were to read about estate planning or legacy planning. So let's dive into that. Why is that? There was actually an in-depth qualitative interview study that found why it was. It's because for some people, terms like estate or legacy, those are a bit too grand for them. They say, oh, estate planning, that's the people on Downton Abbey who go riding their ponies across the Vale in the morning. Those are people who have estates. That's not me. But if we say will planning, oh, well, yeah, everybody needs a will. Yeah, that applies to me. Now, here is the next thing that was interesting about that. When we ask them, when you click on that button for gifts and wills or will planning, which of the following types of information are you expecting to read? Believe it or not, they were just as likely, actually, in some cases, even more likely to expect that they were going to get information about living trusts and life insurance and IRA TODs and bank account TODs from the term will planning or gifts and wills than from the term estate planning or estate giving. So I know that's technically incorrect. I am an estate planning attorney. I get that they're using it the wrong way. But if we use the technically correct terms, they don't want to read about it. So we need to be sensitive to these things, use simple language and stories rather than diving in at the beginning with the technical, legal, or financy language.
This might be obvious, and I totally understand the estate planning. I've never really thought about it that way, but it does make sense that people would, like you said, think about an abbey and the London farm side in England or something, but why do you think people turn off so quickly to the technical language? I mean, I know storytelling and talking about a donor's values and their relationship to the mission is definitely more effective, but why do people kind of glaze over at the technical language?
Yeah, I think part of that has to do with the idea that when we are giving, right, when we are sharing, that's something we do in a social or family frame of mind, okay? When we are engaged in competition in the market, we're trying to gain advantage, we're worried about being taken advantage of. That's where we use those finance terms, those legal terms. And so it kind of changes the frame of mind once we lead with that finance legal terms. It's, now I'm in a market exchange contract frame of mind, right? That frame of mind is not the one that encourages sharing. It is more that social frame of mind that encourages sharing. And this actually goes all the way back to the work of fundraising. Fundraisers are trying to build social family type connections, not market exchange transactional connections. Because if somebody comes at it with a transactional point of view, well, they're never going to make a donation because, well, I keep more if I never give anything to anybody. So I think that's part of the psychology that's behind it.
That's great. Thank you for clarifying that. Actually makes a lot of sense. When we're talking about a donor's story and a donor's values and a donor's relationship to organizations that they care about and their missions, I use this word all the time in my writing, and the word is legacy. And I've recently changed my wording where I have stopped saying leave a legacy and have started saying create a legacy. Where does the word legacy fit into all of this? Since we're paying attention to so much precision of language, is that a word because I feel like legacy and talking about death are more closely aligned than some other things we might talk about. How does that word fit into this conversation?
So legacy is the right idea, but it doesn't work well as a word for exactly the same reason that estate doesn't work well. Legacy is just a bit too grand for most people. Like, I'm not really in that category. But if we change it to something like making a lasting impact, that's a way where we can tap into that same desire for permanence, right? To make that lasting impact, but not use a phrase that people oftentimes are not interested in that. So for example, people are more interested in reading about will planning than legacy planning, or gifts and wills than legacy giving. Again, it comes back to that, well, that doesn't really apply to me, right? So if we use some substitute terms that communicate exactly the same idea, because it is the right idea, but communicate it in a little bit more sort of common everyday language, that may work better, actually.
Okay. So this is a little bit close to home, but I'm thinking about, so, we're talking a lot about individual relationships with donors and one-on-one stewardship.
Mhm.
But what about the language in, say, organizations' marketing materials or the materials that they communicate to their donors on a broad scale? I work on some newsletters that the title is The Estate Planner. So I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on, like, backing up a little bit, zooming out a little bit,
Mhm.
on just general language that nonprofits use in, their mailings and things like that?
Right, right. So the thing that I suggest is that if you want a larger audience, don't lead with death. Let me give you an example of this. So when I first started out, so this is 1994, as a new estate planning attorney, and I was working for a religiously affiliated college. And so I did what my predecessor had done in planned giving, which is to put together an estate planning seminar to offer it in the churches that supported the college. And I put together a fantastic seminar on estate planning. And both of the people who showed up for it agreed that it was great. But I had to learn that if I wanted a larger audience, I needed to lead with a different topic. Now, so for example, in that context, as a lawyer, I changed the topic to Christians and the law, and we would talk about religious liberties issues. And then the last third, we would talk about stewardship and estate planning issues. There was another person, a friend of mine, who had the same experience. He was actually working for the Archdiocese of New Orleans. He wasn't a lawyer. So he changed his topic to senior concerns. So we would talk about health-related issues, Medicare, and then again, the last third is estate planning. Now, in terms of broader communication, a way that we can get a larger audience by not leading with death is, instead of here, I'm going to talk about charitable estate planning, maybe I'm going to talk about how to give smarter. Here's my top 10 tips for how to give smarter. And I'm going to start out with something that's not death related. Maybe the idea of, well, if you give appreciated assets rather than cash, you get a double tax benefit with the avoidance of capital gains taxes. And then, by the way, any of that IRA or 401k money that goes to the family, they've got to pay income taxes on it. But any of that comes to us, there's no income taxes. Now, notice I'm only at point 2, and we're already talking estate planning, right? I'm going to have other estate planning tips that, for points 4 and 6 and 8 and whatever. But the idea is that we are not leading with death. We are just talking about a general topic, and along the way, we mention the death-related topics. Now, if you want the larger audience, then that works. More people will come to those seminars. They'll be interested in reading. They'll request that information. Now, I don't say don't ever lead with death, because if you have a captive audience, meaning that they're in the office or they're already in the seminar, you can be as blunt as you want to lead with death. Why would I say that? Remember, there's only 2 responses to those death reminders. The first one is avoidance. Well, guess what? They're already stuck with you, so there is no opportunity for avoidance. So what's that going to do psychologically? It's going to ramp up the alternative response, which is that pursuit of symbolic immortality, that desire for permanence. And if your organization is offering them that opportunity where they could make a lasting impact by making that estate gift, then that's going to become more psychologically attractive, especially if you're offering things like an endowment, a professorship, a scholarship, a lectureship, an endowment funding a favorite part of operations, whatever. People become very hungry for that permanence in that kind of a context. But if we want a larger audience, then we're going to generally lead with a somewhat broader topic that doesn't lead with death.
Wow, I always learn a lot from these podcasts, but you've just kind of shook into the core my whole approach to a lot of the writing that I do on plan giving, which is
well, and I'm
excited about. Yeah.
Yeah, and do keep in mind, if we lead with death and we call it estate planning, there will be a group of people who have moved past that avoidance stage, and they're more in the I'm ready to plan today stage. It's just going to be a smaller audience when we lead with those topics. And so that is something to keep in mind, that there, again, the 2 responses, the avoidance response, if they're in that camp, then we're not going to reach that group. With that, kind of approach. If they're already beyond the avoidance response and they're into this thinking about their legacy, that is the smaller group, but more well qualified that we will reach with that kind of communication.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the science and the sentences. This is a phrase that you use, and this is kind of a two-parter. You've tested this language scientifically, and I'm just curious about the science aspect of it. Mm-hmm. How did you use science? What types of tests did you use for your research? And then I'm just curious about what were some of the phrases or approaches that really surprised you when you were doing this research?
Well, let me give you an example. So in some of my research, actually here at the Texas Tech Neuroimaging Institute, we actually put people in brain scanners and we had them make charitable decisions, including charitable gifts in wills. So for example, we would show them a variety of organizations and ask about if they wanted to include that organization in their will. And we compared that to the neural activation if they were just making a small gift or volunteering. And what we found was that what was unique about the charitable bequest decision is that it uniquely involved visualized autobiography regions of the brain. So these are places that activate simultaneously when people are mentally traveling back in time or thinking across their life course. And the greater that visualized autobiography activation was, the more likely they were to say, yes, I want to include that charity in my estate document. Now, by the way, there was a similar result from a colleague of mine in England who did qualitative in-depth interviews with older adults about why they had picked the charities they had picked. And what she found is that when she talked with them, there was typically a clear link with the life stories of those donors. So it wasn't about the latest project at the organization. It was about how that cause or organization connected to their life story. So we took those two things and now we bring it over into the more practical. So in this experiment, we actually tested 24 different kinds of bequest gift descriptions among nearly 10,000 participants. What was the winning description? Well, it was not just make a gift to charity in your will, which was the most powerful base phrase, but it was make a gift to charity in your will to support causes that have been important in your life. Now, notice what happens when I use that phrase. If I ask you about your interest in make a gift to charity to support causes that have been important in your life, what does that do? Well, it triggers life review. You don't want to be that guy who says, no causes have been important in my life. Well, we know from the neuroimaging that that is the neural pathway that predicts you saying yes to including a charitable gift in your will. Other things that we've learned is that the social norm statements are very powerful in a death-related context. Sharing stories of what people like you have done is very powerful. So, for example, we know that the phrase, many people like to leave a gift to charity in their will, that is powerful. It increases the interest for those kinds of gifts. But believe it or not, that phrase actually worked better when it was many people like to leave a gift to charity in their will because they care about causes that are important in their lives. So that's an example of how all of these things can kind of triangulate to give us a better insight into what works and why it works.
And there's some really powerful subtleties there. That's fascinating. On behalf of all the rest of us, thank you for diving into that work and just really doing a very thorough excavation of the potential and possibilities there. Another thing you talk about is also, I just love this concept of the visual autobiography. We know storytelling is so powerful. What about silence? You talk a little bit about this concept of the softest ask. And I don't want to oversimplify it or butcher it here, but using silence and letting the donor decide where the conversation goes, which I think might tie in a little bit to your concept of Socratic, using the Socratic method in this. But you talk a little bit about that approach and I know some people really struggle with silence.
Mhm.
You mentioned the year 1994 earlier was when you started, but that was also the year that the movie Pulp Fiction came out. And, that movie kind of classically talked about this idea of the uncomfortable silence.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of people really struggle with it. So can you just tell us a little bit about this softest ask and how we might
Mhm.
use silence?
Sure. So, of course, silence is always the fundraiser's superpower, right? If you make an ask, after you make the ask, everybody hopefully knows what to do, which is to shut up. You're going to want to fill that space or, make excuses or add information. No, no, no. After you make the ask, you just shut up. Why? Because we all have that natural pull to want to fill in that with information. You want the donor to not only have time to think, but fill it in with information. Well, there's another way we can use this that is kind of as you call it, the softest way that we can bring up this topic in a way that can be very powerful. So I like to call it the 4S method, and that's for 3 stories and then shut up. So how does this work? Let me give you an example of it. Suppose you were an alum of Texas Tech, and I was a fundraiser there. At some point, what's going to come up in the conversation is, hey, what's new at Texas Tech? And so I might start with a story like, well, we're really excited about our football season coming up. Hopefully the injury to our quarterback will recover and he'll be able to start early in the season. And a lot of new construction on campus. Believe it or not, we're over 42,000 students now. You can see where those new residence halls are going up on the west side. Oh, and John Smith did a neat thing. Now, did you know John? He graduated just 2 years before you. Well, John spent his career helping other people get their finances in order. And he recently signed a new will that one day will create a permanent endowed scholarship for our financial planning students. And then you take a drink. That's the 4th step, right? You create this silence, and here are a couple of different outcomes that can result from that. One, if you've reached somebody at a point in their lives when they want to continue this conversation, you've given them an opportunity to talk about this kind of planning. Now, if you've reached somebody at a point in their lives when they don't want to continue that conversation, then you'll hear some response like, oh, those new buildings, where would I park if I wanted to see them? And you might think, oh, I tried it and it didn't work. But here's the fascinating thing. We have tested message after message to see what is the most powerful message to change people's attitudes about including a gift in a will. And that most powerful message is a living donor story about someone like the person you're talking to who has included a gift in their will that reflects their life story. Well, you have accomplished that in a very up close and personal way, even if you're not there when the gift itself is actually signed. And notice some of the underlying strategies here. We don't lead with death. We tell 3 stories, and the first 2 have nothing to do with death. And when we share that story, we're creating a social norm. Oh, here's a person like you. Now, I mentioned somebody who graduated near the same time, but there's lots of different ways that the example person might be like the person you're talking to. And if you can't think of any, just say, you remind me of this person. Maybe because, if nothing else, you care about many of the same things. So the idea is that we give that example, and notice that little twist that what were they giving the gift to? Well, it was a permanent endowed scholarship. Oh, we've got permanence, something I can visualize, an impact that I can make. So that's an example of how we can bring it up in a really soft, safe way. And oftentimes, I'll be honest with you, the hesitation doesn't come from the donors, it comes from the fundraisers. So with all of these different strategies or approaches, the most effective strategy is whatever you will actually use to bring up the topic. Because if you won't use it, then the topic doesn't get brought up. And that's one thing we do know from the experimental research, that just asking the question is very powerful at getting people to include these gifts.
Just asking the question. I'm taking my notes here. We're getting to the end of our time, and we've learned we don't want to lead conversations talking about death, want to avoid transactional language. We want to rely on the question. And all of the research that you've done, and I know you spent much of your career translating complex research and topics into really practical advice that we can all use. I guess based on your research, are there any other misconceptions about this stuff that are floating around in the plan giving world that people maybe still hold to be true that you wish the profession would let go of, or that your science kind of undermined in any way?
I think one of those is that there is a huge mismatch between what actually brings in the dollars and what our metrics are. Because oftentimes I will see metrics in the plan giving space that is number of legacy society members. Now, the reality of the dollars in estate gifts is that they are highly skewed. That is that for most organizations, if we were to say, would you rather have your 10 largest gifts or everything else for the estate gifts? Many times they would say, oh, just give us the 10 largest estate gifts, right? So as somebody with a PhD in economics, to count everybody as one, well, that doesn't seem to make sense. Here is the challenge. Big gifts are more challenging for leadership because fundamentally big gifts come with instructions. That's what makes them compelling. That's what makes them really reflect my life story. And so when we look at what big estate gifts look like, they look like private family foundations with all of those rules and all of those instructions for years and years. Actually, in some years, 3/4 of all the charitable estate dollars go to private family foundations. But they also look like permanent endowments, professorships, scholarships, endowments funding a favorite part of operations. Here is where that mismatch happens. The small estate gift, the pat on the head gift, the, well, we've included you gift, doesn't do anything in particular. It doesn't have any particular instructions. If you want to actually focus on bringing dollars to the organization, we're going to focus on number one, we're going to focus on older donors. But even once we get in the plan, we're not just going to say, oh, they're a legacy society member, we can just count it and forget it, right? Wrong, wrong, wrong. Those plans are highly fluid. If we ignore them, they will ignore us when they do the next estate plan. But we can actually have conversations that ramp up that gift. Something as simple as this. Well, thank you so much for including a gift in your will to treat us like a family member. That means so much. Let me ask you, have you ever thought about how you would like your gift to be used? And they might say, oh, well, just whatever you need it for. Well, the reason I ask is this. I was working with another donor. You remind me of him. You both have a real heart for this cause. And he decided to create a permanent endowed professorship so that there would always be someone doing research in his field of interest. Now, this will come from a $1 million gift in his will, and I didn't know if that type of gift might appeal to you. Then we have the silence. Then maybe we hear, oh, that's a bit more than I was thinking about. And well, maybe we then talk about a scholarship fund that starts at $50,000. Okay, whatever the case may be. The point is, what we have done is move beyond the pat on the head gift. And we've now started to talk about impact. Impact comes with price tags. So now we have a reason not just for the gift, but for the gift of a certain size. And it is that process of making the gifts particularly personally meaningful for the donor, giving them some permanence, connecting them with the donor's identity that leads to those really big gifts. And those are the kinds of gifts that can move the needle for our organization in terms of impact. So I think it is those conversations. And by the way, they can lead to current gifts too, because once they've set that up in their estate plan, we talk about, oh, what about starting that now while you're still alive? But the idea is, again, coming back to not just gifts, not just, well, I've got a 40-year-old who's added us as a beneficiary of a life insurance policy, or I've got an 85-year-old who's added us into as half of their estate in their estate plan, and we just count them both as one. It's also going beyond and understanding what those big gifts look like and changing the metrics a little bit, where we appreciate that these, even though they're revocable, plans from older donors are more valuable, plans for larger gifts are more valuable.
Wow, thank you. I put that question towards the end because I wasn't sure if it was going to be relevant. And so that was a great answer. I'm glad I asked it. So thanks for sharing that. So I am not an expert in plan giving. I've been in the field for a short time. And I think your experience and knowledge probably begins right around where mine ends. And so oftentimes I don't always know the right questions to ask because I don't know what I don't know, right? So is there anything that we haven't really talked about today or touched on that you would like to add to this conversation?
Yeah, so for fundraisers that are afraid of the area, I don't want to talk about that. I'm not an expert. I'm not a lawyer, whatever. A couple of things are important to keep in mind. One, we are there to share stories and bring ideas. We're not going to be drafting documents. We're not going to be executing transfers, but we do have an important role. So when we share stories of what other donors have done, when we can give ideas that, ultimately may be executed other places, that can be really valuable. The other thing to keep in mind that I think is very helpful for fundraisers to understand is that if you begin to have a conversation, maybe it's an estate giving conversation or an asset giving conversation, you don't have to immediately answer the question on the fly. So many fundraisers are afraid of this because they think, oh, I'm going to have to pass some CPA tax law exam right there by instantly giving the right answer. Actually, we'd rather take a different approach. And that approach is our goal for the conversation is to get the next meeting at which we can present some valuable options. You see, that de-stresses that initial conversation. So the idea also is that you have time to go back and, oh, well, here's the donor situation, and maybe some of these creative options are available. We can pick up the phone, we can do some research on the internet, we can talk to AI, and we can come up with some valuable strategies that we can then present at that next meeting. It's super powerful because it de-stresses that initial meeting. We're not supposed to give the right answer. If we give a hyper-technical question, we use that to say, oh, that's a great question. I want to talk with some of our experts to put together the best answers for you here, but I'm pretty sure there is a solution for you. Would you mind getting together in a couple of weeks? I can share with you what I came up with some different ideas. Okay, that's how we use that, not as a tragedy that they gave us a hyper-technical question, but as a motivation to have that next meeting. Then we can take the time in the interim to put together a variety of ideas, and then we can present those ideas to the donor. That's what you would call a proposal meeting, right? Well, it de-stresses that initial conversation, but it's also powerful for the donor because leading up to that next meeting, they're thinking about their asset. They're thinking about doing something charitable. That's a great wealth sharing mind space that we want the donor to be in. So I would just encourage folks, don't be afraid to open up these conversations. Managing assets and the stories behind them, that's a big part of the lives of high net worth people who often are engaged in those things. And we just want to elicit a little bit about their past, present, and future story of that asset. The past, how they got started, the present, what's going on now, to get to the fundraising punchline. What's the fundraising punchline? What are your future plans for the asset? Because spoiler alert, there's only two. They're either going to sell it or or they're going to die with it. And both of those are great opportunities for charitable planning and plan giving.
Wow, thank you. This has been a really amazing experience. I've learned so much. Well, yeah, we'll go into these conversations with these donors and we won't lead with the topic of death, and we'll share stories, offer ideas. Those initial meetings, I guess we should leave our calculators and our copy of Estate Planning for Dummies at home. Well, Dr. James, as always, thank you so much for joining us. I really hope to have you back sometime and talk more about the amazing, brilliant, and integral work that you're doing out there in the field of plan giving. And again, on behalf of the plan giving community, thank you.
Well, thanks, Grant. I appreciate that.
And if you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, share it with a colleague, and join us next time for another conversation on the ideas, people, and strategies shaping the future of charitable gift planning. And to all of our listeners, thank you for being a part of this conversation. Until next time, I'm Grant Miller. Thanks for listening. We hope today's discussion gave you practical takeaways to grow your plan giving program. To submit questions and topics for future episodes, go to sharpgroup.org or listen to us on your favorite podcast app. If you found this podcast insightful, be sure to like, review, and subscribe. Until then, stay sharp.